This can't be right. No. Read it again. No, absolutely not. Read it again. You have to be reading this incorrectly.
I have read it correctly.
That is impossible. My father would never do this.
I understand this is difficult.
No, you're mistaken.
Jonathan, please explain exactly what we're hearing. I assure you presented exactly as instructed. That doesn't make sense.
Can someone please explain, who exactly are we talking about? My father spent his entire life building this company.
Mr. Bennett, please come forward.
Me?
There has to be some kind of mistake.
There wasn't.
But before we reveal how this case took a shocking turn, we want you to be part of this story. Subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable stories of justice, betrayal, redemption, and the hidden truths behind the moments that changed people's lives. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Your city could be the next place we mention in our stories. Now, let's return to the beginning. Because before the truth was buried, there was a moment when everything started to fall apart. 3 hours earlier, most people entered Ashford Global Holdings without ever noticing the man who kept it spotless. Every morning before sunrise, Samuel Bennett quietly polished the floors, cleaned the glass, emptied the bins, and disappeared into the background before the executives filled the building. To nearly everyone, he wasn't part of the company. He was simply the janitor. Samuel Bennett had worked inside Ashford Industries for nearly 20 years. Most people remembered his uniform. Very few remembered his name. Yet every single morning, without expecting recognition, he quietly made someone else's day a little easier. Most people believed Charles Ashford only noticed executives, investors, and board members. They were wrong. For years, he quietly paid attention to the people everyone else overlooked.
Thank you.
Kindness was never part of Samuel Bennett's job description. It was simply the way he lived. Most people barely noticed.
Small things.
One man did. It lasted less than 30 seconds. Samuel thought it was just another polite conversation. But Charles Ashford had just found something he valued more than talent. Character. By that afternoon, everything changed. The man who had built one of America's most successful companies was suddenly fighting for his life. And his family had no idea the decision he had already made would change all of their lives forever. Less than an hour later, one unexpected phone call brought the entire Ashford family together. No one spoke much during the drive. The city outside blurred past the windows, but inside each luxury SUV, thoughts raced much faster than traffic ever could. Jonathan gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Victoria stared silently through the passenger window, replaying the morning in her mind. Nicholas checked his phone every few seconds, hopping for an update that never came. No one knew exactly what had happened. Only that Charles Ashford had been rushed to the hospital. And when a man like Charles Ashford suddenly disappeared from public view, people noticed. Within an hour, rumors had already begun spreading across boardrooms, investment firms, and newsrooms. Some claimed he had suffered a heart attack. Others whispered that he had collapsed during an important meeting. No one knew the truth. Only the doctors. And they weren't talking. By the time the family arrived at St. Matthew Medical Center, the atmosphere felt painfully quiet. The polished white corridors echoed with hurried footsteps. Nurses moved with calm efficiency. Doctors disappeared behind secured doors. Every passing second seemed to stretch into an eternity. Jonathan was the first to reach the private waiting area. What happened? No one answered. Victoria arrived moments later, followed closely by Nicholas. Their eyes searched every face in the room, looking for reassurance. Finding none. Then they saw her. Eleanor, Charles' wife. She sat alone near the window, both hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup that had long since gone cold. Her eyes were red, not from panic, from waiting. She slowly looked up as the children entered. No one needed to ask the question. Her silence answered it first. Jonathan finally broke it. How bad is it? Eleanor swallowed slowly, then quietly replied, The doctors are still trying. The room fell silent once again. Even Nicholas, who always seemed to have something clever to say, found nothing. For the first time in years, the Ashford family wasn't arguing about money, or business, or power. They were simply waiting. Waiting for the man who had always seemed impossible to break. The clock on the waiting room wall seemed louder with every passing minute. Tick, tick, tick. No one looked at it. No one needed to. They could feel every second slipping away. Jonathan paced the length of the room before stopping beside the window. Victoria remained seated with her hands folded tightly together, staring at the floor. Nicholas stood near the coffee machine, pretending to read emails that he hadn't actually opened. Even their phones had fallen silent. For once, there were no business calls, no meetings, no negotiations, only uncertainty. Then the doors at the end of the corridor opened. A senior physician walked into the waiting room. His expression said everything before he spoke a single word. The room froze. Jonathan took one step forward. Doctor. The physician removed his glasses for a brief moment before looking at each member of the family. I'm very sorry. We did everything we could. No one moved. It was as if the words refused to settle. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Victoria covered her mouth with both hands. Nicholas stared blankly at the floor. Eleanor slowly closed her eyes. 48 years of marriage, reduced to one unbearable sentence. Charles Ashford was gone. The following days unfolded like a blur. Television stations interrupted their programming. Financial analysts debated what his passing would mean for the markets. Newspapers described him as a visionary, a builder, a legend. Former employees spoke about his discipline. Business leaders praised his brilliance. Politicians issued carefully worded statements. To the world, Charles Ashford was an icon. But inside one quiet funeral chapel, he was simply a husband, a father, a grandfather, and the empty seat at the front of the room reminded everyone that even the most powerful lives eventually come to an end. Hundreds of mourners filled the chapel. Executives, board members, old friends, community leaders, people whose lives Charles had changed in ways both public and private. One by one, they offered stories about his generosity, his determination, his impossible standards. Yet something unusual caught Victoria's attention. Near the back of the chapel, standing quietly beside the entrance, was a familiar face. A man wearing a simple dark navy suit. Not expensive. Not tailored. Just neat. Respectful. Samuel Bennett. He kept his head lowered throughout the service. He didn't approach the family. He didn't speak to reporters. When the final prayer ended, he quietly placed a single white lily beside Charles's photograph, then turned and walked away before anyone noticed. Almost, because someone did notice. Nicholas watched him leave. His brow furrowed. Then he quietly asked, "Who was that?" Story 4, Part 3. The question lingered in Nicholas's mind long after the funeral ended. Who was that? No one answered. Not because they didn't want to. Because none of them knew. Samuel Bennett quietly returned to work the following morning. The same Navy maintenance uniform. The same hallway. The same cleaning cart. The same routine he had followed for nearly 20 years. If he had learned anything from life, it was this. No matter how painful yesterday had been, people still expected clean floors today. He never imagined that before sunset. His own life would change forever. 3 days later, the Ashford family gathered inside Harper and Cole attorneys. The atmosphere was nothing like the funeral. Grief had quietly given way to anticipation. Jonathan arrived first. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had spent years preparing to inherit an empire. Victoria entered moments later, composed as always, though the lack of sleep showed beneath her eyes. Nicholas walked in last, greeting everyone with polite smiles that failed to hide his curiosity. Eleanor quietly took her seat near the window. No one spoke much. The room was silent, except for the soft ticking of an antique clock mounted on the wall. Then the conference room door opened. Evelyn Harper walked inside carrying a thick leather portfolio. For over 30 years, she had served as Charles Ashford's attorney. She knew every contract, every acquisition, every private instruction. And today, she carried the last one. She placed the portfolio carefully on the polished walnut table, looked around the room, then spoke calmly. "Thank you all for coming. As you know, Mr. Ashford prepared very specific instructions regarding today's meeting." Jonathan leaned forward. "I'm sure we all understand why we're here." Evelyn met his eyes. "I believe you do." She slowly opened the portfolio, removed a sealed envelope. Across the front, written in Charles's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 simple words. "Read exactly as written." Evelyn carefully broke the seal. She unfolded the first page. The room became perfectly still. She began reading. "To my family, if you're hearing these words, then I am no longer with you." Victoria lowered her eyes. Nicholas swallowed quietly. Even Jonathan's confident posture softened for a moment. Charles's words continued. "I've spent my life building a business, but I've spent far more time trying to understand people. I have made mistakes. I've trusted the wrong individuals, and I've overlooked the right ones." A long silence settled over the room. Jonathan shifted impatiently in his chair. Evelyn turned the page. "Everything I own, the company, my personal investments, my real estate, my controlling shares, and every remaining financial asset. I leave." Jonathan allowed himself the smallest smile. Victoria glanced toward him. Nicholas folded his hands confidently. Evelyn looked down at the final line, then stopped reading. The pause felt endless. Jonathan frowned. "Well, Evelyn slowly looked up. Her expression remained completely neutral. She read the next sentence exactly as Charles had written it. I leave everything. To Samuel Bennett. Silence. Complete silence. No one moved. No one breathed. For a moment, it seemed as though nobody had actually heard the words correctly. Jonathan blinked. What? Nicholas looked toward Victoria. Victoria stared at Evelyn, certain she had misread the document. Evelyn calmly looked back down, then repeated the sentence. I leave everything. To Samuel Bennett. Jonathan pushed his chair backwards so suddenly that it scraped loudly across the hardwood floor. That's impossible. Victoria immediately shook her head. There has to be some mistake. Nicholas laughed once. Not because anything was funny. Because his mind refused to believe what he had just heard. The janitor. The company janitor. Evelyn calmly folded her hands. There is no mistake. Jonathan slammed both palms onto the conference table. My father spent 50 years building this company. And you're telling me he left every single thing to a maintenance worker. Evelyn didn't flinch. I am telling you exactly what your father instructed me to tell you. Jonathan looked around the room in disbelief. This is insane. Nicholas shook his head repeatedly. He barely knew the man. Then, for the first time, Evelyn allowed herself to speak without reading. She quietly said, I'm afraid that is where you're wrong. Fade to black. Story 4, Part 4. No one spoke. Jonathan slowly lowered himself back into his chair. He stared at Evelyn as though waiting for her to smile. To admit this had all been some elaborate misunderstanding. She didn't. Instead, she reached back into Charles's leather portfolio. There are additional instructions, and Charles specifically asked that these be read only after his decision had been announced. Jonathan folded his arms. I'd love to hear how he planned to justify this. Evelyn unfolded another handwritten letter. She recognized Charles's handwriting immediately. Steady, precise, unmistakably his. She began reading. Jonathan, if your first reaction is anger, I understand. Mine would have been the same 40 years ago. Jonathan's expression hardened. Evelyn continued. Victoria, if you're searching this room for a legal mistake, there isn't one. Victoria slowly lowered the document she had been studying. Nicholas, if you're already wondering how to challenge my decision in court, you'll only waste your time. Nicholas gave a quiet, uncomfortable smile. His father knew him too well. Evelyn turned another page. Charles's words became more personal. You all believed I built this company by making good business decisions. You're only partly correct. The greatest decisions I ever made were never about business. They were about people. Jonathan interrupted. This still doesn't explain Samuel. Evelyn calmly raised one finger. Your father specifically instructed that no one interrupt the reading. Jonathan reluctantly sat back. She continued. For years, you believed Samuel Bennett was simply the man who cleaned the building. You walked past him. You greeted him politely. Sometimes, you didn't notice him at all. But I noticed him. The room fell silent. I noticed that he arrived before everyone else, and usually left after everyone had gone home. I noticed that he never complained. I noticed that he remembered birthdays. I noticed that he knew every employee's name. From interns to senior executives. Nicholas shifted uncomfortably. He couldn't remember Samuel's face. Only the uniform. Charles continued. There is an old saying. You can judge a person's character by the way they treat people who can do absolutely nothing for them. I tested that belief many times. And every single time. Samuel passed. Evelyn lowered the letter for a moment. She looked directly at Jonathan. Your father anticipated that question. She turned another page. Charles had written one additional note beneath that paragraph. If you're still wondering why I respected Samuel so deeply, let me tell you what none of you ever bothered to notice. The maintenance department lost one of its employees during the winter of 2017. No one attended the funeral, except Samuel. He drove 3 hours after finishing his shift. He stood beside the family and quietly handed the widow an envelope. Inside was every dollar of overtime he had earned that month. She never knew who it came from. I did. The following summer, a young intern accidentally backed his car into one of the executive parking barriers. He couldn't afford the repairs. He believed his career was over before it had even begun. Samuel repaired the damage himself. After work, over 3 consecutive evenings, he accepted nothing in return. One December, the heating system failed in the oldest section of the building. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Samuel stayed through the entire night. He made certain every office was warm before the first employee arrived. Nobody thanked him. He never expected them to. I once asked Samuel, why do you keep helping people who don't even notice? He smiled and answered, because needing help shouldn't depend on being important. Jonathan looked at Evelyn. What does that even mean? Without answering, Evelyn simply continued reading. The first time I truly noticed Samuel, I intentionally dropped my wallet. I wanted to see what would happen. I expected him to hand it to security. Instead, he ran nearly half the length of the building to return it personally. He never opened it. He never counted the money. He simply smiled and apologized for interrupting my day. Victoria looked surprised. She had never heard this story. The second time, I watched from a distance as a new receptionist accidentally broke an expensive crystal sculpture. She believed she would lose her job. Samuel quietly swept up every broken piece. He told her, people matter more than things. Then he accepted the blame himself. He received the written warning. She kept her job. He never told anyone. Jonathan slowly looked away. The third time, I discovered something that changed me. I was working late. Almost everyone had gone home. I passed the cafeteria. There was Samuel. He wasn't eating. He was packing half of his dinner into a small container. I asked him why. He smiled and said, my wife likes this soup. Evelyn paused. Even she found herself smiling. I later discovered his wife was receiving cancer treatment. They couldn't afford the hospital cafeteria. So every evening, Samuel quietly shared his own dinner with her. He believed nobody knew. I did. Silence settled over the conference room. No one looked at Jonathan anymore. No one looked at the table. Instead, everyone seemed to be looking inward. For the first time, the name Samuel Bennett no longer sounded like the name of a janitor. It sounded like the name of a man they had completely failed to see. But Charles wasn't finished. There was still one final truth, and it would change everything they thought they knew about Samuel Bennett. Fade to black. Story 4, Part 6, Final. No one left the conference room. Not immediately. The silence had become too heavy. Jonathan remained standing beside the table, staring at the letter his father had written. Victoria quietly looked out the window. Nicholas sat motionless. For the first time in years, there was nothing left to argue about. Only truths they wished they had learned sooner. Jonathan finally broke the silence. "Where is he?" Evelyn looked up. "Who?" "Samuel." Evelyn glanced toward David Cole. David quietly answered. "He doesn't even know." The room fell silent again. Jonathan frowned. "What do you mean, he doesn't know?" David checked his watch. "He reported to work this morning. Like every other day. He clocked in at 7. He cleaned the east wing. And at noon, he left for lunch. He has absolutely no idea this meeting is happening." Jonathan slowly sat back down. For some reason, that hurt more than anything else. Jonathan stared at David. "He doesn't know." David slowly shook his head. "No. He reported for work at exactly 7 o'clock. He cleaned the east hallway. He replaced 2 broken ceiling lights. He helped a new receptionist move 3 heavy storage boxes. And at 11, he stopped to congratulate one of the security guards on becoming a grandfather." Jonathan frowned. "How do you know all that?" David gave a small smile. "Because that's who Samuel is. He notices everyone, even when nobody notices him." Benjamin Ross quietly spoke for the first time. "Charles asked me something 6 years ago." The room turned toward him. "He asked me, Benjamin, if one day I placed this company in Samuel's hands, would you help him?" Jonathan looked stunned. "You knew?" Benjamin nodded. "I knew your father was preparing something. I just never imagined it would be this." Across town, Samuel Bennett sat alone on a wooden bench outside a small neighborhood park. His lunch was exactly the same as it had been for years. A homemade sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water. He watched children laughing on the playground, smiled quietly, then folded the wrapper neatly before placing it inside a nearby trash bin. His phone began to ring. He looked at the unfamiliar number, almost ignored it. Instead, he answered. "Hello." A calm voice spoke. "Mr. Bennett." "Yes. My name is Evelyn Harper. There is something Mr. Charles Ashford asked me to discuss with you." Samuel smiled politely. "I'm sorry. I think you've called the wrong Samuel." "No, I don't believe I have. I'd appreciate it if you could come to my office this afternoon." Samuel looked genuinely confused. "I'm just the maintenance worker." Samuel looked around the empty park. Certain someone had confused him with another employee. There are almost 40 maintenance workers. "I'm afraid you've got the wrong man." The voice remained calm. "No, we're looking for Samuel Bennett, the gentleman who has worked in the headquarters building for nearly 20 years. Samuel laughed awkwardly. "That's me. But I don't understand." Evelyn replied gently. "You don't have to understand yet. I simply need you to come." Samuel hesitated. "I'm still wearing my work clothes." There was a brief silence. Then Evelyn smiled. "Mr. Bennett, Charles never cared about your clothes. He cared about your character." Samuel stood quietly. Those words stayed with him long after the call ended. For reasons he couldn't explain, he suddenly felt nervous. "I know. That's exactly why Mr. Ashford wanted to speak with you." The line went quiet. Samuel stared at his phone, certain there had been some misunderstanding. Less than an hour later, he stood nervously outside the conference room. The same room he had cleaned hundreds of times, never once imagining he would someday be invited inside. He adjusted his inexpensive navy suit jacket. It was the only suit he owned. The sleeves were slightly short. The shoes had been polished carefully that morning. He took one deep breath, then gently knocked. "Come in." Samuel slowly opened the door. The entire Ashford family turned toward him. Jonathan, Victoria, Nicholas, Eleanor, David, Benjamin. Every eye in the room settled on the quiet maintenance worker. Samuel offered an awkward smile. "I'm sorry. I was told someone wanted to see me." No one answered immediately. Finally, Evelyn stood. She walked toward Samuel holding Charles's final letter. She smiled warmly. "No mistake this time, Mr. Bennett." Charles was waiting a very long time for this moment. Months later, the headlines finally faded. The legal battles never happened. Not because they couldn't, but because Charles had prepared for every possibility. His wishes stood exactly as written. To the surprise of nearly everyone, Samuel didn't begin spending money. He didn't buy sports cars. He didn't move into a mansion. He didn't surround himself with luxury. Instead, his first decision shocked the board of directors. Every lowest-paid employee across the company received a significant salary increase. Medical benefits were expanded. Scholarship programs were created for employees' children. Emergency hardship funds were established. Cleaning staff, security guards, receptionists, maintenance workers, people who had spent years feeling invisible, were suddenly seen. Samuel only asked for one thing: no employee should ever feel forgotten. The months that followed surprised everyone. Samuel refused to replace the executive dining room. Instead, he renovated the employee cafeteria. He declined a luxury company vehicle. Instead, he purchased 3 new maintenance trucks. He canceled executive bonuses that year. Not out of anger, but to establish a company-wide emergency fund for employees facing financial hardship. At first, some shareholders criticized him. Then something unexpected happened. Employee turnover dropped to its lowest level in company history. Productivity increased. Customer satisfaction reached record highs. People weren't working harder because they feared losing their jobs. They were working harder because, for the first time, they believed someone at the top genuinely cared. Benjamin Ross quietly smiled the day he read the quarterly report. He whispered to himself, "Charles, you were right." That evening, the Bennett home was unusually quiet. The television remained off. No one reached for their phones. Grace quietly placed 3 cups of tea on the kitchen table. For several minutes, no one spoke. Samuel simply stared at Charles's final letter lying beside him. He still struggled to believe any of it was real. Grace reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. "You're still thinking about him?" Samuel nodded. "I keep asking myself, why me?" Grace smiled softly. "Because Charles finally saw what I've seen for 30 years. Samuel looked down. Grace continued, Do you remember the winter Emily needed surgery? Samuel laughed quietly through his tears. I'll never forget it. Grace nodded. You skipped dinner almost every night. You kept telling us you weren't hungry. Samuel looked away. Grace squeezed his hand. I knew the truth. You wanted Emily to have enough. Emily smiled. I didn't know that until Mom told me years later. She looked at her father. You never wanted us to feel guilty. So you pretended you weren't hungry. Samuel's eyes filled again. Grace wiped away one of her own tears. You weren't trying to become wealthy. You were simply trying to become a good husband, a good father, and a good man. She smiled. Maybe this isn't God making you rich. She looked toward Charles's letter. Maybe it's God showing the world the man you've always been. Samuel finally lowered his head into his hands. For the first time since leaving Harper and Cole, he allowed himself to cry. Not because of the inheritance, not because of the money, but because after an entire lifetime of quietly putting everyone else first, someone had finally seen him. Emily stood, walked around the table, wrapped both arms around her father. Dad, you've always been our hero. We're just glad the rest of the world finally knows it. The three of them sat together in silence. No fortune in the world could have made that moment more valuable. One afternoon, several months later, Jonathan quietly walked through the same hallway where Samuel had worked for nearly 20 years. He found Samuel exactly where he had always been, speaking with employees, learning names, listening. Jonathan walked over. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Jonathan extended his hand. I spent years walking past you. Samuel smiled gently. I know. Jonathan looked down. I'm sorry. Samuel shook his hand, then smiled the same humble smile he had worn his entire life. We all get another chance. Charles Ashford had left behind an empire. But that wasn't his greatest legacy. His greatest legacy was proving that true wealth has very little to do with money. Because fortunes can be inherited, businesses can be built, power can disappear overnight. But character is earned one quiet decision at a time. And sometimes, the richest person in the room is the one nobody noticed. Fade to black. Call to action. If this story moved you, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from. Is it the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, or somewhere else in the world? And before you go, subscribe to Mindfold Stories, because the next story may completely change the way you see the people around you. Sometimes, the greatest heroes are hiding in plain sight.